On the morning of August 6, 1945, the sky over the Japanese city of Hiroshima was clear and blue. People were walking to work, children were heading to school, streetcars were running their normal routes. Some were eating breakfast, others were waiting on the stone steps of a bank for it to open. Thousands of school children were already out in the streets that morning, helping adults tear down old wooden buildings to create fire breaks across the city center. It was, in every visible way, an ordinary morning in an ordinary city. High above, a single American aircraft was flying, but no air raid sirens sounded. Solitary planes had become common enough that people had stopped reacting to them, and an earlier alert that morning had already been called off. At 8:15, something fell from that aircraft. 43 seconds later, a second sun appeared over the city. Today we're going to tell the real story of what happened that morning, what the people beneath that blast actually experienced, and the myths that have grown up around this day over the past 8 decades. Before we continue, this is a heavy and historically significant topic, so we're going to treat it with the seriousness it deserves. To understand how the world arrived at that morning, we have to go back a few years earlier. In the middle of the deadliest war in human history, physicists had come to realize that splitting the atomic nucleus, a discovery that had until recently been a matter of pure scientific curiosity, could be turned into a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. The United States, fearing that Nazi Germany might develop such a weapon first, launched a massive, highly secretive program that would become known to history as the Manhattan Project. It involved tens of thousands of workers and some of the finest scientific minds of the era. And remarkably, the overwhelming majority of the people involved had no idea what they were actually helping to build. By the summer of 1945, Germany had already surrendered without ever completing its own bomb. But the war against Japan continued, brutal and unrelenting. On July 16th, in the New Mexico desert, the first successful test of an atomic device in human history lit up the sky, visible from hundreds of miles away. The project's scientific director, Robert Oppenheimer, later said that in that moment he recalled a line from an ancient Hindu text describing himself becoming death, the destroyer of worlds. The weapon was ready. What remained was deciding whether to use it, and if so, against which city. The process of selecting a target is one of the grimmest chapters in this entire story. A special committee reviewed several Japanese cities against a set of chillingly specific requirements. The city needed to be large enough to matter, hold genuine military significance, and critically, remain relatively undamaged by conventional bombing so that the destructive power of this new weapon could be measured in isolation, without the results being muddied by prior damage. Hiroshima fit perfectly, a major port and military hub, home to an army headquarters, and a city that American bombers had, almost deliberately, left largely untouched throughout the war. Some residents had even begun quietly speculating about why their city seemed to be spared. Kyoto, the ancient cultural capital of Japan, was also on the target list at one point, but it was personally removed by U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who reportedly knew and admired the city, having visited it in his younger years. In this way, one official's personal memories may have saved centuries of temples and hundreds of thousands of lives, while Hiroshima's fate was effectively sealed by a combination of geography, weather patterns, and bureaucratic targeting criteria. The city's residents had only weeks left to live, and they had no way of knowing it. In late July, the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, warning of swift and total destruction if the terms were rejected, without specifying what that destruction would actually involve. Japan's government, deeply divided between factions favoring peace and a military leadership still pushing for continued resistance, responded with a single word, mokusatsu, a term that could be translated either as "we are considering it" or as "we are ignoring this with contempt." The Allies interpreted it as the latter. Whatever narrow chance existed to halt what was coming had passed, and the machinery of war moved forward. In the weeks leading up to that morning, Hiroshima had continued functioning as a wartime city, tense but orderly, spread across 6 islands in a river delta connected by dozens of bridges, filled with military factories and refugees who had fled other bombed-out cities across Japan. Fearing the kind of incendiary firebombing raids that had already devastated Tokyo and dozens of other Japanese cities, local authorities had been demolishing buildings throughout the city center to create fire breaks, and thousands of schoolchildren had been mobilized to help with this work. It's precisely because of that mobilization that, on the morning of the attack, entire groups of children were working outdoors in the heart of the city. And it's one of the most painful aspects of the entire tragedy that school children in the city center were killed in overwhelming numbers. Shortly before 8 that morning, an American reconnaissance plane had passed overhead, triggering a brief alert that was called off soon after, and people, accustomed to seeing lone aircraft pass without incident, calmly returned to their morning routines. Only minutes remained before everything changed. Early that morning, a B-29 bomber took off from the island of Tinian in the Pacific. Its commander, Colonel Paul Tibbets, had named the aircraft after his own mother, Enola Gay. In its bomb bay sat a uranium weapon carrying the almost incongruously gentle nickname Little Boy, roughly 10 feet long and weighing more than 4 tons, with an explosive force equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of conventional explosives, a quantity that would otherwise have required thousands of aircraft to deliver. The flight took about 6 hours and proceeded without incident. The Enola Gay wasn't flying alone. It was accompanied by additional aircraft carrying measuring instruments and cameras, while separate weather reconnaissance planes flew ahead over the potential target cities, their reports ultimately determining which city would be struck that day. Just before the detonation, instruments were parachuted down from one of the accompanying planes to measure the coming blast wave, and some residents below, spotting the white parachutes in the sky, mistakenly assumed they were witnessing a paratrooper landing or a leaflet drop, and looked directly up at the sky, a moment of curiosity that would cost many of them their eyesight. The weather over Hiroshima was clear that morning, and that clarity sealed the city's fate, since it had been designated the primary target, with backup cities reserved only in case of cloud cover. At 8:15 local time, the bomb was released. The crew executed a sharp turn to escape the coming blast wave. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of roughly 1,900 feet above the city center, almost directly above a hospital, the weapon detonated. Those who witnessed the flash and survived described it as a silent white sun that seemed to fill the entire sky. The tail gunner aboard the Enola Gay, watching the growing column of fire below, spoke words into the plane's intercom that would later be quoted around the world. "My God, what have we done?" What actually happened on the ground in those first seconds is almost beyond ordinary comprehension. At the point of detonation, temperatures reached millions of degrees, comparable to conditions inside a star. The thermal radiation from the flash ignited anything flammable for miles around. For people caught out in the open near the epicenter, death came instantly, faster than the mind could register what was happening. The blast wave followed immediately after, flattening lightweight wooden homes across a radius of several miles like houses of cards, collapsing concrete structures, throwing people through windows, and turning shattered glass into countless deadly projectiles. Then, across a devastated city where thousands of stoves and cooking fires had just been overturned during the breakfast hour, a firestorm swept through, a blaze so intense it generated its own wind system, pulling in air and leaving no chance of escape for anyone trapped beneath the rubble. Of the roughly 350,000 people believed to have been in the city that morning, tens of thousands died instantly, and by the end of that year, the death toll, according to various estimates, had reached approximately 140,000, a figure that doesn't include those who would die from radiation-related illness in the years and decades that followed. These numbers are still being refined even today, since entire families and neighborhoods vanished in that devastation, leaving no one left to report them missing. A few hours later, another horror fell over the city. A black rain of sticky, radioactive droplets darkened by soot from the fires. Exhausted, desperately thirsty survivors caught the rain in their mouths, unaware they were drinking poison. This is a good moment to pause on one of the most famous and most widely misunderstood images associated with Hiroshima, the so-called shadows. On the steps of a bank, on bridges and walls, the outlines of human figures remained etched into the stone after the blast, giving rise to a haunting myth that people had simply vaporized, leaving only their shadow behind on the surface. The reality, while different, is no less devastating. The intense flash of heat and light instantly bleached and scorched exposed surfaces of stone and pavement, while any area shielded by a human body directly in the light's path remained comparatively dark. In other words, the shadow isn't a trace of a vanished body. It's the outline of the space a person's body blocked from the light. The people themselves died from burns and injuries. They didn't disappear without a trace, as later depicted in various fictional portrayals. One such shadow, the silhouette of a person who had been sitting on the bank steps, waiting for it to open, was cut out of the stone along with the surrounding surface, and is preserved today in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum as one of the most haunting physical pieces of evidence from that morning. The science here doesn't soften the horror of what happened. It simply strips away the more fantastical version of events, leaving behind a truth that's arguably more disturbing than the myth itself. What happened in the city in the hours and days that followed comes to us largely through the testimonies of survivors, known in Japan as hibakusha, literally those who experienced the bombing. Their accounts paint a picture that's difficult for the mind to fully absorb. The city itself had effectively vanished, familiar streets and landmarks were gone, and survivors wandered through smoke, across terrain they no longer recognized, despite having lived there their entire lives. Silent processions of burned survivors made their way toward the rivers, driven by an almost inhuman thirst. Help was scarcely available anywhere. The overwhelming majority of the city's doctors and nurses had been killed or injured since the hospitals themselves had stood near the epicenter. At one of the city's largest hospitals, out of dozens of doctors on staff that morning, only a single young surgeon remained standing, and he worked for days without sleep, treating an endless line of the wounded. Help eventually arrived from surrounding towns as people walked into the burning city searching for relatives, and soldiers and volunteers worked to clear the rubble. Many of these rescuers, who had suffered no visible burns or injuries themselves, would later fall ill after inhaling radioactive dust and debris at the site. Remarkably, within just a few days, electricity was restored to surviving parts of the city, and streetcars began running again along the tracks that had survived. And for many survivors, the sound of that streetcar bell ringing amid the ruins became one of their first memories of life beginning to return. And then, within days, something began happening that nobody at the time understood. People who had appeared physically unharmed began losing their hair, their gums started bleeding, purple spots appeared across their skin, and one by one, they grew weaker and died. This was acute radiation sickness, a condition medicine at the time knew almost nothing about. Doctors, in their desperation, referred to it simply as a mysterious epidemic. People who had miraculously survived the blast and the fire were now dying weeks later from something entirely invisible. This second unseen wave of death would become perhaps one of the most chilling discoveries of the entire atomic age, a weapon that kept killing long after the explosion itself had ended. The way the wider world learned what had happened is its own strange and unsettling story. Hiroshima simply went silent. Telegraph and telephone lines went dead, the local radio station stopped responding, trains stopped running. In Tokyo, officials initially assumed some kind of technical failure or the result of an ordinary bombing raid, and sent an officer by plane to investigate directly. While still more than 90 miles away, he could already see an enormous column of smoke rising, and upon approaching, found no city beneath him at all, only a burning plain. Japan learned the full truth from its enemy. 16 hours after the explosion, U.S. President Harry Truman announced over the radio that an atomic bomb, a weapon harnessing the same force that powers the sun itself, had been dropped on Hiroshima. For most people on the planet at that moment, including most Japanese citizens, the words atomic bomb were being heard for the very first time in their lives. In a single day, humanity learned it was now living in an entirely new kind of world. Japan had barely begun to comprehend the scale of what had happened when the next blow fell. On August 9th, 3 days after Hiroshima, a second bomb, a plutonium weapon nicknamed Fat Man, was intended for the city of Kokura, but cloud cover and smoke over the city that morning spared it. The aircraft made several passes, failed to locate its target visually, and diverted to its secondary target, Nagasaki. To this day, there's a phrase in Japan, Kokura's luck, describing an unknowing escape from a disaster one never even realized was possible. Nagasaki lost tens of thousands of residents, though its hilly terrain partially shielded parts of the city from the blast wave. On that same day, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, launching a massive offensive against Japanese forces in Manchuria. On August 15th, something unprecedented happened. Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people directly over the radio for the first time in history, announcing the country's surrender. Millions of Japanese citizens heard for the first time ever the voice of a man many had regarded as a living deity, and many struggled to fully grasp the deliberately vague, formal court language in which the surrender was described, stating only that the war situation had developed, quote, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. World War II had ended. Historians continue to debate, to this day, exactly what ultimately broke Japan's resolve to keep fighting: the atomic bombings, the Soviet Union's entry into the war, or some combination of both, a debate unlikely to ever be fully settled. This broader debate also touches on the question of warning. American aircraft had indeed dropped millions of leaflets over Japanese cities urging evacuation, but Hiroshima itself was never specifically warned about an atomic attack. Preserving the element of surprise was considered a military necessity at the time. Leaflets explicitly mentioning this new weapon were only dropped over Japanese cities after August 6th. Defenders of the bombing's necessity point to projections at the time estimating that a planned invasion of the Japanese home islands could have cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, and that every additional month, the war continued cost enormous numbers of lives across Asia more broadly. Critics respond that Japan was already nearing collapse and actively seeking a path toward peace, and that striking a city full of civilians can't be justified through military arithmetic alone. This remains one of the most difficult moral debates of the 20th century, and any honest account of this story has an obligation to present both sides fairly, without rushing to easy conclusions. Among the thousands of individual stories from that August, a few are especially worth knowing. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum preserves objects that convey the human scale of the tragedy far more powerfully than statistics ever could. A rusted tricycle that belonged to 3-year-old Shinichi Tetsutani, who was riding it in his yard at the exact moment of the flash. His father buried him in the garden together with his favorite toy so his son wouldn't be lonely. And only decades later did he move the remains to a proper grave, donating the tricycle to the museum. A charred lunchbox, packed that morning by a mother for her teenage son, who was never found, its contents turned entirely to carbon, untouched. And dozens of wristwatches and wall clocks, their hands permanently frozen at 8:15, the exact moment time itself seemed to stop in this city. There are also stories almost too improbable to believe. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, an engineer on a business trip in Hiroshima on August 6th, survived the blast, made his way home, burned and injured, to his actual residence in Nagasaki, and on August 9th, while describing his ordeal to his supervisor, saw a second flash through the window. He survived both atomic bombings, lived to the age of 93, became the only person officially recognized by the Japanese government as a double hibakusha, and spent much of his later life speaking publicly against nuclear weapons. And there's the story of a young girl named Sadako Sasaki, who was 2 years old at the time of the bombing. She grew into a healthy, athletic child, the fastest runner in her class. Until 10 years after the war, she was diagnosed with leukemia, a disease the city came to call the atomic bomb disease. According to Japanese tradition, anyone who folds 1,000 paper cranes will be granted a wish. From her hospital bed, Sadako folded crane after crane from whatever scraps of paper she could find. She died at the age of 12, and the paper crane went on to become a worldwide symbol of remembrance for the victims of nuclear weapons. Even today, children from around the world send millions of paper cranes each year to Sadako's memorial in Hiroshima. Another widespread belief at the time held that nothing would grow again on the scorched earth of Hiroshima for 75 years. People genuinely believed this, and yet by the very next spring, oleander flowers were already blooming among the ruins, and green shoots were pushing up through the ash. For a traumatized population, this became a powerful sign that life was, in fact, stronger than what had been done to it. To everyone's astonishment, dozens of trees survived as well, scorched ginkgo and camphor trees standing just a few hundred yards from the epicenter sent out fresh buds that following spring. These trees, having survived an atomic blast, remain alive to this day, marked with special plaques, and their seeds and saplings have been distributed around the world as living messages of hope. The oleander has since become Hiroshima's official flower. The city itself never truly died. Hiroshima was rebuilt, and today it's a thriving city of over 1 million people, with skyscrapers, factories, and its own professional baseball team. The same streetcars run through its streets once again, and remarkably, several cars that survived the blast were repaired and continued running on the lines for decades afterward, serving as living memorials in daily use. At the city's center, the ruins of an exhibition hall were deliberately left untouched, its skeletal dome having survived largely because the bomb detonated almost directly above it. Known as the Genbaku Dome, or Atomic Bomb Dome, it's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the defining symbol of the city. Beside it spreads the Peace Memorial Park and Museum, a visit many people from around the world describe as leaving them literally breathless, along with an eternal flame that, by design, is meant to burn until the day the last nuclear weapon on Earth is dismantled. Every year on August 6th, at 8:15 in the morning, the city falls silent. A bell rings, and that evening, thousands of paper lanterns bearing the names of the dead are floated down the river. Over time, Hiroshima has become something of a global site of pilgrimage. Heads of state and popes have visited. In 2016, Barack Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit the city, embracing survivors at the memorial. Years later, leaders of the world's major economic powers held a summit there, opening it by laying flowers at the victims' memorial. The United States has never formally apologized for the bombing, and what strikes many visitors is that Hiroshima itself, notably, doesn't ask for one. The city chose a different path, not settling a score with the past, but issuing a warning to the future. The Hibakusha, whose numbers grow smaller every year, spent decades carrying their memories to the world, while also overcoming considerable injustice at home. Since for years, survivors of the bombing faced discrimination rooted in unfounded fears about contagion, which cost many of them job opportunities and even marriage prospects. These survivors transformed their own suffering into a warning for the rest of humanity, and it's largely thanks to them that the world has, so far, never repeated what happened that August. This tragedy also carries a scientific dimension worth mentioning on its own. After the war, the fates of Hiroshima's survivors became the subject of the longest continuous medical study in human history. For decades, researchers have tracked the health of hundreds of thousands of Hibakusha and their children, and this data forms the foundation of almost everything modern medicine understands about the effects of radiation exposure on the human body, informing safety standards for X-ray equipment, nuclear power plants, and space travel used around the world today. Some early fears turned out, remarkably, to be unfounded. Scientists found no significant increase in hereditary diseases among children born after the war to survivors, a rare piece of genuinely good news to come out of Hiroshima's story. The research itself, however, began under difficult circumstances. The first American medical commissions studied survivors extensively, but under the rules governing their work at the time, didn't provide them with treatment, a coldness that left lasting resentment among many Hibakusha. Only over time did this work evolve into a genuine joint Japanese-American research project serving the benefit of humanity as a whole. In this way, a city that became a victim of science weaponized for war ultimately helped generate knowledge that protects lives across the entire planet. So what's the larger lesson of this story? Hiroshima remains the first, and along with Nagasaki, thankfully still the only use of nuclear weapons in warfare. 80 years have passed since that morning. In that time, global arsenals have grown to tens of thousands of warheads, each many times more powerful than the bomb that struck Hiroshima. And yet, not a single one has ever been used against people since. Consider that for a moment, by the standards of modern weapons, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima is now considered relatively small. And that's perhaps the most important reason why remembering the real, lived experience of that day, rather than an abstract statistic, matters so much. Because Hiroshima showed the entire world, without exception, what actually lies behind the sterile language of megatons and kilotons. Not numbers, but burned-out streetcars, black rain, 1,000 paper cranes, and the shadow of a human being permanently etched into stone steps. Remembering this city isn't about assigning blame for the past, it's an investment in the future. And as long as humanity remembers the morning of August 6th, it retains the chance to never let it happen again. And so we reach the end of this journey through the story of Hiroshima, a city destroyed in an instant and rebuilt into a thriving symbol of peace, carrying a warning that its survivors devoted their lives to sharing with the rest of the world. If you made it this far, you now know the real history behind this day far better than most people who only know it as a date in a textbook. If you found this video meaningful, please consider sharing it and leave us a like and subscribe with the bell turned on so you don't miss the stories we have coming next. See you on the next journey.